The struggle against apartheid in South Africa featured prominent historical figures that are celebrated in many political and social circles today. One notable example is this man, Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. He founded the Pan-African Congress of Azania, a liberation movement that is now a political party. Sobukwe was an advocate of African nationalism and black majority rule. In this special episode of the book series, we learn about his political writings, speeches, testimonies, and interviews from two South African professors who recently published a book entitled Darkest Before Dawn: Writings, Testimonies, and Correspondence from the Life of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. This book was published by Wits University Press, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that is in the description panel of this video. I spoke to these two professors earlier this morning. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making the time. I would want us to start with the introductions. I want to give you all time to just briefly talk about yourself, talk about the research that you have been doing, the teaching that you have been doing, all the work that you have been doing in the knowledge industry in the past. I will begin with Professor Derek. This is your time.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us both on and giving us this opportunity. I'm a professor of psychology along with Leswin. We're in the same department of psychology at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. It's an unusual department because although we're teaching psychology, it's also very open to philosophical and historical ideas. And so, we're talking about a book on Robert Sobukwe, but you'll notice that both of us are in a psychology department rather than a history department. And I think you'll start to get a sense of why that is. But just to give you a sense of my current teaching, I do a lot of teaching at a graduate level for clinical psychology courses, but also I'm teaching at the moment a course on Frantz Fanon, who maybe some of your listeners and viewers will be familiar with, a psychiatrist, a revolutionary figure, the author of Black Skin, White Masks. And between those various interests, you can start to see why a book on Robert Sobukwe from South Africa might start to be of interest. I'm going to pass over to Leswin. I'm sure he'll also have something to say about that.
Yeah, well, I won't repeat that our department is a rather unique one, approaching psychology as a human science rather than a natural science, and it reflects in the courses that I teach and the research that I've done. For example, on Emmanuel Levinas, the French philosopher, I've just written a recent book on. I also teach on Jacques Derrida, another philosopher, and I teach in terms of the questions that we ask about these philosophers' import on psychology. Why do we need to take note of them? But both Derek and I have also done research on apartheid. I published on phenomenological psychology and qualitative research. And of course, we've also done work on the phenomenology of race and racism, and co-edited a book on Fanon most recently. Yeah.
That is excellent. Thank you so much for that. So I would want you to answer two questions. How did you develop the idea for this book, and what do you think are the core ideas of the book and its central argument?
One thing is worth mentioning, Leswin and I didn't actually explicitly mention it, but we're both in the same department in Pittsburgh, but we're both from South Africa. And, we've both had some exposure growing up in apartheid South Africa. And I think that's always part of what informs what we're trying to do as teachers. So not only that has meant that the type of psychology we've been involved in has often had a more kind of sociological or philosophical orientation. And it's also meant that we've been particularly interested in figures like Fanon, who is, in many respects, a psychologist, but he's also thinking about racism. He's thinking about social theory. Now, the next step from thinking about Fanon would be to think a little bit about how does that history feature in the history of South Africa? And there we will start to think about someone like Steve Biko, Black consciousness, and the anti-apartheid struggle. And that looms large, I think, if I may speak for Leswin and myself, in our shared histories. And of course, what that then made, I think, both of us a little bit interested in, maybe particularly by being in the United States at some distance from South Africa, is who are the great figures of the anti-apartheid struggle. And just to give that context to some of your listeners and viewers, this was a period of white supremacy, maybe one of the most egregious forms of white supremacy still available to living memory, actually, that was enacted within South Africa's system of apartheid. So there were many figures who became heroic anti-apartheid struggle leaders. The big icon that everyone knew was Nelson Mandela. But there was another figure, and his name was Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, who was a contemporary of Mandela, but whose story was far less often told. And there's multiple reasons for that, but he had a slightly different ideological orientation, but he was a man of great charisma, great leadership. He was a kind of magnanimous man, an intellectual, a leader, and he had a vision that he wanted to pursue of Pan-Africanism. And I think in today's world where we constantly hearing calls for decolonization, his legacy deserves a little bit of remembrance and returning to. So I'll just say one other thing before passing on to Leswin. We try to find some material on Sobukwe, and because in a sense, the legacy of Mandela seemed to overshadow, like almost completely overshadow the legacy of Sobukwe, there wasn't an awful lot of material. But then one day there was this great discovery in an archive of a library in South Africa. I came across a whole bunch of handwritten letters that he had written from prison. And of course, if you were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle and you were a leader, as was Sobukwe, certainly a leader of his stature, you were going to end up in jail at some point. So he spent a lot of time on Robben Island, which is a little island off of the shore of the Western Cape of Cape Town. And he was given a kind of solitary confinement. He was separated from other prisoners, but he was writing letters. And of course, one of the real tragedies is that we don't have a recording of Sobukwe's voice. And what we have is some historical documents where people have written about him, but that was why it was so exciting to find the letters. So the letters were his own handwritten letters where he was in correspondence with some people who helped him. Not helped him, who were in contact with him and giving him information and being in contact with family. So this book is actually the follow-up to a first book, which is just called Lie on Your Wounds. And this one just collected a whole series of the prison letters. And the idea with that was to edit them, but to edit them lightly so that Sobukwe's voice could come through in those letters. The follow-up book, I'll leave that to Leswin, is in a sense continuing that, but after the period that Sobukwe was released from Robben Island, because the story takes on a slightly different quality from that point on.
So if the first book was about the prison correspondence, that's Lie on Your Wounds, the book that we are discussing today, Darkest Before Dawn, takes up, well, it actually has two parts to it. On the one hand, it takes up the story after his release and house arrest. On the one end, and on the other end, some of his speeches and writings from before he went to Robben Island. So one could say that the first book is kind of like the sandwich, it's like the filling in between the two slices of bread that this book is. So this book tells the story up to his prison sentence and what happened afterwards. So for many South Africans and for many people, there's a very well-known, almost intuitive public understanding that this man was in prison. But there's almost no sense of the personal story about what happened after his release, You must understand the man was politically muzzled. He couldn't say anything publicly. He couldn't do any political speeches or be involved. So the only thing we have are some of those letters to other people that he wrote and that people wrote to him. So we basically wanted to tell a story in this book about those two periods, and to tell it by looking over his shoulder, as it were, to tell it about his lived experience on both ends, both a political and a personal story. A story about the struggles and concerns, the joys and sufferings, the conflicts and achievements, the loves and sorrows of an extraordinary man, to be sure, but also of the everyday of this man's life after release from prison on the one end, and the speeches and the and court trials that led up to his arrest. So in a sense, both books taken together attempt to tell a story of sorts, not the story, but a story about this man, Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, about his humanity, his ethics, his politics, which is also simultaneously about the inhumanity and the lack of ethics and the callous brutality of apartheid, really,
One thing that I have to emphasize that I think is particularly important about the book is that it has an interdisciplinary quality in it. When I saw the book, I could easily tell that this book is of interest to students of history, to students of psychology, to students of political science, to students of different disciplines. And that is an important point that we always want our authors to interact with and to engage with, especially on this platform being an interdisciplinary platform. So I would want you to maybe describe what you consider to be the major contribution of the book to the particular discourses that you think that the book feeds into. Because when we look at the book as historians, we feel that it's a good book for us. When political scientists look at it, they also feel that it's a good book for them. But we would want to know from you, the authors, what major contribution you think the book makes to the discourses that you were engaging with.
One of the ideas behind the book, which we were very excited about, if the first book was about restoring and editing and putting together a vast array of letters that weren't really easily accessible before, that meant that you were kind of privy to, you could read Sobukwe's voice, which, as I've mentioned, wasn't very accessible, given that the apartheid state completely muzzled him, as Leswin said. You were able to access a little bit more of his letter writing informal voice. Now, of course, the letters in the prison context were going to be censored, but nevertheless, his personality, a sense of the man really came through with those letters. But then for the second book, what we wanted to do was also include some of the speeches, some of his own texts, and also some interviews about him, because again, those weren't always easily accessible. But you could also then say, well, for a historian, to answer your question, it's valuable to have those texts, those speeches. But we also wanted to keep a real strong sense of the man, of, again, his personality. So what I think we're really happy with in this book is that we've got a section that includes some of the speeches, his own writings, his own, not just the speeches, but he also published some articles about Pan-Africanism, about African nationalism, about the importance of these particular modes of struggle and resistance to apartheid. But we got those alongside a lengthy biographical, I suppose it's an essay that we wrote, almost like a little mini book. And what's interesting about that is every now and again, you'll see that there's shared moments where he'll say something in a letter that also appears in the speech. And so we get this interesting interplay between the formal historical documents of what we've reproduced in the book, as well as the more, as it were, personable biographical moments where the same fact comes up again. And so the idea is, and why hopefully this will appeal to people in different disciplines, is we have a kind of more psychology angle in as much as we do a portrait of Sobukwe, but we also want to give some of the historical text. The other thing, just to mention briefly, is in the course of working on the book, we were really surprised and happy to find that there was some court testimonies which had never been published before. And so if you, as it were, overlap all of those things, you've got snippets from his letters, you've got interview material, you've got speeches, you've got textual writings, and you've got court testimonies. And if you overlap all of those things, you start to get a kind of multidimensional perspective on the voice, on the persona of who Sobukwe was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just to add quickly that we were acutely aware of the fact that we are not professional historians, whatever that means or whatever comes with it. I imagine there's many different kinds of professional historians, but you'll permit me the stereotypical sense of it. But we live the period in a certain sense that we write about. And so we can tell stories about our own histories and about apartheid. And in some ways that we felt that, well, I guess we can tell a little bit of a story about apartheid through the voice of someone like Robert Sobukwe. But we also never wanted to make excuse for the fact that we are psychologists, albeit psychologists of a rather unique and different stripe. But be that as it may, we also didn't want to let go of the fact that we are qualitative researchers, we are phenomenologists, we can think deeply about the meaning of lived experience and about what it is to be. And I think all of that, we just said, well, let's just tell a story about Sobukwe. It's not going to be a psychological case study. Good heavens, it certainly is not that, But it is also it's not a literary biography or historical whatever the formal protocol might be for such a thing. Instead, what we said is, let's look over his shoulder. And I like that phrase very much. We peered over his shoulder as he wrote, as he spoke, and we would present those writings and voices for our time through extensive footnotes, for example. And we would translate it from where we were psychologically as fellow travelers, as fellow South Africans, as travelers from the future, basically, and tell us as a story that was multifaceted, as Derek already said, and in a certain sense, at least for me, I can't speak for Derek, without regard for the discipline that we were in, to just meet the man and try and be truthful to that meeting, to facing up to the man that we've met, and the discipline stuff can come later. I think that was at least for me the case.
That is great. Thank you very much for that. It's also very important to emphasize that somebody doesn't necessarily need to be a historian to engage with the historical stuff. Or to be a psychologist to engage with psychology stuff, because we look at these things from a special point of view and in particularly different kinds of ways. But thank you very much for that response. So now, what were the major findings of the book and what major lessons can we learn from it? I was happy to hear when you gave your first submissions that some of the most popular or famous characters that we know in the history of South Africa, the history of apartheid, is Nelson Mandela, is people like Chris Hani, people like Steve Biko, but it is surely the case that people like Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe is not that much popularly known or written about, particularly in these academic discourses. So what would you say are the major findings of the book and what are the major lessons?
One of the things that I think is kind of fascinating, and that happens when looking at the historical documents, is you start to realize there's a bit of a story behind the evidence that you've got. So I already alluded to the fact that there's a kind of layering of different types of materials. And sometimes if you're spending enough attention looking at the letters, you start to wonder, why does Sobukwe say this in the way he does? So I think what we've tried to do with that layering, I'm still responding to your previous question in some ways, is for people to get a sense of like how they're understanding what's going on in the letters. So we try to make a space for the reader. But I'll give you some examples of the story behind the story. There'll be things that Sobukwe would say when in letters. And he would make a little reference to say something like Steve Biko. And of course, because all the letters, even though he had been released from prison, he was still being watched. He was still subject to surveillance, and all his correspondence, banning orders. And this is important to mention, I think, because for many of us, it's almost impossible to imagine in today's sort of social mediatized world. He was not allowed to meet with more than 2 or 3 people at a given time. He was not allowed to publish, to speak in a public context, and he was subject to constant surveillance. So that's why I mean, when he makes a small reference in a letter to something like Steve Biko, you start to realize that there's very possibly a whole story behind that. So one of the great sort of unexplored moments in the history of the struggle in South Africa is there were a couple of meetings between Sobukwe and Steve Biko. In the book, we mention that, and we offer some speculations about that. But I think that was one of the most interesting facets for us to think about, how there was some kind of passing of the torch, so to speak, between an older generation, Sobukwe's generation, which was the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was all about Sharpeville, which is all about really trying to bring the apartheid government to a standstill. And then there was a whole wide-ranging series of arrests, which meant that that part of the anti-apartheid struggle really kind of halted for a while. And then the younger generation of people like Steve Biko in the 1970s and the Black consciousness movement. So some of what was said in some of those meetings, we can only speculate about, but that was really fascinating. But one of the other things that we were surprised and happy about to find was there in the archives, we find there's a letter, more than one, 2 letters from a woman called Bessie Head. Now, Bessie Head was a novelist. I believe she came from Botswana, but she was in South Africa, or certainly went back to Botswana. And she had a very tumultuous life, but her literary works are, famous and well known. And no one, I'd done research on Sobukwe for some years, but there was no indication that they'd had any correspondence. So in the book, we include some of those letters. And I suppose what I'm saying then is, what's interesting about the book is you realize exactly how big a deal, to use a non-very academic term, Sobukwe was in the impression, in his reputation, on a whole generation of intellectuals, of scholars, of activists. And in a way, we've kind of lost sight of that. But this was a period when there was decolonization with a capital D happening across Africa. Ghana gains independence. Various African states are starting to gain independence. Sobukwe sees this, and he thinks that in his lifetime, there's a possibility of a United States of Africa. So there's something heroic about this. And I suppose, to try and keep it as short as possible, his influence on a huge generation of people, on Africa and Africans, was somehow much bigger than I think that we sometimes realize in today's world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we respond to the world from where we are, and I think in as much as contemporary folks just don't realize, as Derek said, how big a deal Sobukwe was in the 60s and 70s. Sharpeville was, in a very real sense, and I want to be careful with how I say this, it's appropriate as an important marker, a watershed moment in South African history, the massacre at Sharpeville, and it is the moment on which a lot of international sanctions and decrying of the apartheid state hinges. And there's a way in which it has become part of the narrative of the ANC, for example, or there's a way in which we remember Nelson Mandela and the very important role of the ANC. But underneath that, almost like a current, is this Sobukwe influence, not just on the literary figures and on the important people of the day. Sobukwe was characterized by the South African government as the most dangerous man alive at some point. He was separated from all other prisoners. And so I think that part, to bring that to realize the importance of the day, of the present day, from a man who has been all but erased in many circles, from such acknowledgement, was important, and was brought home again by doing this work. But to your question about some of the very specific things that stood out to me was, quite frankly, Anotida, that this is a profoundly good man, if I may put it so bluntly as that, a profoundly ethical man, and a man that was a revolutionary by virtue of that goodness and political steadfastness. And even that it is that humanity and political steadfastness that seemed much more dangerous even to an unethical and a violent system, which doesn't know what to do with it because it challenges everything you know or everything you have proposed as the truth. When you meet Sobukwe, he's not the monster you've come to picture him, or to characterize him, or the one that is going to drive all the whites into the sea. An old saying, an old way of saying he's a proper gentleman, to use a colonial way of characterizing. And so, that was part of the story that just stood out to me. I realized that we make him to mean what we want him to mean, and that his afterlife is about appropriating him, many folks, to their political ends. And I guess what the book shows, I hope, is about his humanity, which challenges every appropriation. What the book, I hope, or taught me, is to face up to the fullness of his person, to the fullness of his demand, which is the example of his life, a life that is led with such integrity and honesty and dignity, a life so well led, which is a strange thing to say, given the suffering he endured. But it is also the truest thing to say, precisely given the suffering he endured. And that, to me, is still the remaining thing of what the book taught me, about the fullness of his person alongside the importance of his thought for the time and a whole generation.
Maybe just to build on that, I mean, Leswin's characterization is absolutely correct. We do sometimes forget, I think, that for the apartheid state, Sobukwe was a huge problem. And why was that? Well, one of the reasons he was a huge problem for them was he was a Christian man. He was a very well-educated man. You will often see in representations of Sobukwe, well, people would refer to him as Prof. He had been an academic at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He was so well read. I mean, if you go through the letters, there's Xhosa references, there's references to African folktales, there's references to Shakespeare, to literary history, to economic
Afrikaans poems.
Afrikaans poems. I mean, he's doing these degrees in the period of his imprisonment. And I think this was a real problem for apartheid authorities. Leswin mentioned it, but when he was taken to Robben Island, he was isolated from all the other prisoners. And there was two reasons for that. One is because he had, as it were, served his time for his initial sentence, and I can say a bit more about that. And so he wasn't kind of legally, he couldn't really be legally imprisoned anymore. So he was kind of set aside. But it was also the case that apartheid government was very, very scared of this man. Why? Not simply because he was kind of a radical who was going to destroy the country or something like that, or he was a communist or something like that. Precisely not because of that, because Sobukwe did not like communism, and because he was better, more moral, more ethical, better read, more of an intellectual than many of the people who were proclaiming whiteness as superiority in the apartheid state. And I think that is something that the apartheid government never figured out what to do about. They could not show him to be an inferior or in any way, really. So this also then becomes part of the book because the more recent book is focused on the era after Robben Island. And we see, again, peering over his shoulder, him arriving in this city where he knows no one. Obviously, the apartheid officials put him in a city where he doesn't know anyone, where he's totally isolated, and he has to start all over again after this ordeal of 6 years of imprisonment, largely solitary confinement at Robben Island. And he starts becoming an attorney, a lawyer. He starts kind of making friends again under very difficult circumstances, but they never let him leave the country. And one of the reasons I think they never let him leave the country was that they were aware of just how charismatic, how magnanimous a person he was, and how people were drawn to him, and because of his moral stature. Now, other anti-apartheid leaders had that, but there was an additional element to Sobukwe. Not only was he this intellect and I think ultimately a kind man, a generous man, but the one other thing that was different was, in one sense, there was a way in which, despite all his leadership and all his moral virtues, there was one way that Sobukwe wasn't a political leader. And what do I mean by that? He was absolutely uncompromising. I think if you're going to be like a political leader, at least in my limited understanding, you need to do these negotiations. And Sobukwe was absolutely unwilling to compromise. And I think that's also what gave him the moral stature that it did. But maybe when we look at the image that I'd shared with you a little earlier, Anotida, I'll explain a little bit more about that. But this is why I think he embodied a certain kind of leadership. He was not going to negotiate with apartheid officials. He was not going to compromise in any way. And he believed in Izwiletu, our land. He had a strong commitment to a type of not just African nationalism, but Pan-Africanism. And in that sense, the apartheid government was not going to let him go, because in the book, it becomes so interesting to see how, in a way, there was this history that didn't develop. But he was so close to moving to the United States towards the end of his life. He got offers from universities in the United States, job offers. It was so close to happening. But every step of the way, the apartheid government stopped that. And it was funny, I'm sure Leswin also had this sensation. We're doing all this work on the book, and he starts to feel like he's with us, that he's our contemporary. And it starts to feel like he virtually had a foot in the North American context as well. Certainly in terms of how people are responding to him, wanting him to be a teacher, and so on and so forth. Anyways, let me stop there. But it would be good also to talk a little bit about his moral leadership capacity and why the apartheid government could never really find a way to deal with him, because I think that really gives us a sense of who he was.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's perfect. Thank you so much for that. So what is the target audience for this book?
I think for myself, initially, the imagined audience was every South African alive today. I think, but especially our young adults, those so-called born frees, those 20 and 30 somethings born after the fall of apartheid, and that never have no memory or experience thereof, and only know the ANC government and the world post-apartheid. So in a certain sense, especially that group was what I imagined writing to. But also, as I said, every South African alive today, firstly. And then secondly, I imagine our current politicians and aspiring politicians, if I might break it down, for whom the example of a moral leadership, I think, is a lesson that's sorely needing to be learned, And I was hoping, in my imagination, the story of Sobukwe, I was hoping would speak to contemporary politicians and aspiring politicians in a way that might temper some of the goings on in some circles today. And then thirdly, I imagine an international audience, but maybe Derek can say a little bit more about that. I just wanted to introduce Sobukwe to the world in a very real sense, knowing that he will speak differently to different sectors of that world.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I also, for me, what seemed important is, well, a couple of things. One is, this is a fascinating individual. If you look through some of the photographs, and we've done our best to get as many photographs as we can in that book, this is a man who spends a significant period of his life in solitary confinement. This is a man who talks about his garden. This is a man who has a great love for the African continent, for the people of Africa, for what this can go on to be. And in an era where still we struggle with various types of social asymmetry, with prejudice, with racism, with exclusion, it feels to me that he deserves the recognition of some other great moral leaders in that field, whether we're talking about Martin Luther King or Steve Biko. So he's a fascinating figure for those reasons. But also, it's not just for me the fact that he speaks to Africa. I was alluding to this when I said it feels like he virtually almost had a kind of presence in the United States as well. I think his whole idea of a Pan-Africanism meant that he was fundamentally about the soil, the land, about Africa. But I think in a sense, he was a very international figure as well. I mean, if you read the letters, this is one of the reasons I think he's a role model for us. It sounds funny, but he would talk about Bertie Wooster, which is like some English novel, which is kind of an essence of like some English identity. But Sobukwe is as open to that as he is to the history of the Zulu nation, for example. He's kind of reading all of this material. And I think he's just an exemplary figure, both for thinking about how the whole of Africa could have one day ideally been united, but also for the world, actually. So for an international audience. So when you ask who was the ideal audience for me, I would say any student that comes into a classroom where I'm teaching, any university context, I think it would be just fascinating for people to open up a window into the world that he envisaged and what he was able to do in his lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
That is great. I like the appeal to the general audience, viewers and listeners. Those of you who would want to get a copy of this book, do not forget to click the link that is right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Professor Leswin and Professor Derek, I'm very much excited to have had you on the show today. It has been exciting to learn from you, and I look forward to engaging with you in other future endeavors. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
That is nice.